Welcome to the Mortarboard, the administrator's source for solutions in higher education. We tell you about challenges other schools have faced, benchmark the problem, share their best practices and epic fails, and invite you to consider whether what worked for them might also work at your institution. Hosted by longtime college president Dr. Dan Barwick, this is the Mortarboard, the source for solutions in higher education.
Welcome to the Mortarboard, your source for solutions in higher education. I'm Dan Barwick. Welcome to the podcast. If the content of this podcast interests you, then you'll enjoy my new book, Risk and Reward: How Small Colleges Get Better Against the Odds. It's now available from Amazon in ebook, paperback, and audiobook format. The best way to find it is to head over to my blog, mortarboardblog.com, and click on the link on the front page. If you have any thoughts about the book, don't hesitate to send me an email and let me know what you think. Welcome to the Mortarboard. Our podcast prides itself on providing that 30,000-foot view of higher education. Well, today, it's the 50,000-foot view. I'm pleased to have as our guest Jason Brennan, the Robert J. and Elizabeth Flanagan Family Professor of Strategy, Economics, Ethics, and Public Policy at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University. He specializes in politics, philosophy, and economics, and is the editor of Public Affairs Quarterly. He's also an associate editor of Social Philosophy and Policy. He serves on the Virginia Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, chairs the Designing the Futures Committee at Georgetown, and serves on the Georgetown Faculty Senate. He is the author of 15 books, one of which I'm very grateful to him for taking his time to talk to us about today. Professor Brennan will be talking to us about Cracks in the Ivory Tower, the Moral Mess of Higher Education, which he published with Phil Magnus at Oxford University Press in 2019. This book is a comprehensive critique of higher education, thoughtful, detailed, and well-researched. I'm delighted to have him on the program. Jay, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Well, let's not bury the lead here because I got to tell you, I've really been looking forward to talking to you. Your view of higher education is as critical as anyone I've seen who's offered a detailed critique. Now, you write, and I apologize for the substantial quote that I'm about to read to you of your own words, but here's what you wrote. Quote, "From a business ethics standpoint, the average university makes Enron look pretty good." Enron, the poster child for corruption. That's my words. I'll continue with the quote. "Universities' problems are deep and fundamental, most academic marketing is semi-fraudulent, grading is largely nonsense, students don't study or learn much, students cheat frequently, liberal arts education fails because it presumes a false theory of learning, professors and administrators waste students' money and time in order to line their own pockets, everyone engages in self-righteous moral grandstanding to disguise their selfish cronyism, professors pump out unemployable graduate students into oversaturated academic job markets for self-serving reasons, and so on." End quote. Now, I'm really curious as to what the so on would be after that, but I feel like this whole interview could just ask you to unpack each clause in that quote. But let's start at the beginning. Obviously, you have a fairly dismal view of higher ed. What are the origins of that dismal view for you personally? Have you had bad experiences personally that shaped your views? Did your view form gradually? What can you tell us about how you came to feel this way?
Yeah, thanks for asking. And I should say with the Enron quote, I think that's worth unpacking. One reason I think that is because when you actually look at what happened at Enron and with their accounting firm, what you find is it was a relatively small percentage of people that were involved in that corruption. And then after it was disclosed, that destroyed that company, it destroyed Anderson and destroyed a few others. But we're talking about, in some cases, certain bits of that corruption was maybe 300 people, 500 people. But, like with Anderson, what was the number? 77,000 people lost their jobs, and it was maybe 300 people there that actually were involved. Whereas with regard to higher education, it's almost everybody. Almost everybody is doing something fairly corrupt. And oftentimes not realizing that they're doing it, though not in a way that excuses them. So that's why I say that I think it's more pervasive in higher education than it was in Enron. Now, as for me, no, I've actually had a great experience in higher ed. I can't say that nothing bad has ever happened to me. I can't say no one has ever mistreated me. There has been a bit of that here and there, but it's actually important that I'm a person who's done well, because that is the thing that licenses me to write a book like this. I graduated from grad school. I went to a good program. I got a job in an Ivy League school immediately afterwards. I got hired away at another, somewhat of a peer school at a fancy university for more money sometime after that. I got tenured quickly. I was made full professor and got a chair really quickly. Publishing has been pretty easy to me. I get paid a lot. I even have 2 windows in my office, whereas most people have one. And I have to say that because if I didn't have that, I think readers would rightfully suspect it's a bunch of sour grapes. This is a person who's been mistreated by the academy, and they're calling it corrupt because they're so angry. But I can't say that. It's no, it's been nothing but nice to me, and yet here I am describing what I see. And some of the reasons for this are in part because of my business experience, leaving business and coming back to academia. I worked in an insurance company that is well known for being just an astutely moral place. It really was managed very well. Business ethics really was part and parcel of what they do day to day. They had a very good enforcement scheme to make sure that ethics was part of what you got paid to do. And they meant it, and they enforced it, and it was real. And then within a month of just being a graduate student, I started seeing just very shady things. But I think a lot of it came down to leaving Brown University, where I was at first a research fellow in political science, and I was an assistant professor in philosophy, and going to a business school, realizing I'm not really supposed to be in a business school. And so I was worried that I would not be an effective teacher to business students. And so I started reading very heavily educational psychology, empirical work by psychologists on how people learn and how they don't learn. And then that made me realize a lot was kind of going wrong with my own teaching methods. What I'd been doing wasn't actually effective, not for business students, but wasn't even really particularly good for liberal arts students at Brown. But they thought it was. They rewarded me for it, but they were wrong. They were wrong too. And then from there, as I became sort of more immersed in teaching these classes in business ethics at the business school, it's not all I do, but it's something that I do. I started thinking about how the standards that we apply to other companies, to drug companies, to motorcycle companies, and so on, if we applied them to universities themselves, they would fall far short of them. And so that really started to spur looking into all this stuff and thinking about a systematic investigation into how perverse incentives in higher education lead to dysfunctional behaviors.
Given that you are still fully employed in higher education and have such distinct views, how are you treated by your colleagues?
Everyone's super nice to me. I mean, like I said, it's great. If I walk down the hall, people say hi. They invite me to stuff. People sit next to me at faculty meetings. I'm sure there are people that are grumpy, and I've definitely gotten some angry emails from people outside of the university or outside of my university who might not like something that I've said. But no, I think part of the reason is because when I say this stuff, most of the people recognize that it's true. And so what are they doing? You get angry for me telling the truth? They can't do that.
I wondered though about maybe a bit of self-consciousness. I mean, if you're correct in your views, then you're participating in an endeavor that is corrupt, and so are they. And some people might not like to be reminded of that or to have that pointed out to them. Has no one ever reacted that way?
I think sometimes, in particular with one of the chapters is about how general education classes do not deliver the goods. Empirically speaking, they don't deliver them. And worse, the biggest predictor that someone will be made to take a gen ed class in a particular department is the financial neediness of that department. And we go on to argue that gen eds are largely a form of rent seeking, meaning that departments that need money will make sure that they have members on the gen ed committees or university governance, and then they'll require students to take more and more classes in their department, because at most universities, as I'm sure most of your listeners know, the funding model is that every butt in a seat leads to money being allocated to that department. Ironically, these are often, especially in MLA disciplines, which tend to be pretty extremely left wing, filled with like I want to say they're all Marxists, but a large number of Marxist and Marxist adjacent professors who rail against the evils of exploitative capitalism. And then they have a funding model where they have these lousy classes taught by adjunct professors who, on average, get paid less per semester than I get paid per week, and then a lot of money comes into those classes, which is then allocated to those professors. So there's that kind of thing going on. And sometimes those professors get mad and say like, oh no, I really do believe that gen eds are working. And then I'm just like, well, let me just try to provide you with the evidence that they're not. And like, what are you doing to make them better? So that happens on occasion. But I mean, as for me personally, it's funny. I actually did like a podcast on this very topic about 4 or 5 days ago. And the last question I was asked was about this too. And I really did have a puzzle about it because on one hand, I do think higher education is pretty corrupt overall. I think it has bad business ethics. And so there is this idea of like, what if I just keep my hands clean by going to something else? But there's also this famous argument in philosophy about, maybe you should think about your marginal contribution. Like if you leave, what will happen? Who will replace you? How will they behave? And do you, by being there, make it better than it otherwise would be? For instance, like I'm very well aware of the deficiencies of the traditional way that we teach in terms of its failure to provide skills that students will actually transfer spontaneously to other endeavors. And so my teaching methods are basically all about training people to automatically transfer and to get used to transferring their skills to the real world. And if I leave, then who's going to do that? What kind of education will they get instead? They're going to get, well, frankly, there are people who do better than I am, but they'll probably get somebody who'll do something that's even worse for them. They'll probably get somebody who engages in more rent-seeking than I would. I'm not sure if that's a decisive argument, though. I really do worry about that maybe I should leave.
Let's pursue this idea of exploitation. It doesn't seem that you describe the guiding forces in higher education as sinister so much as they are the product of a series of poorly designed or poorly conceived systems that have resulted in corruption. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's right. We say early in the book that we don't think that the problems in higher education are caused by evil ideology. We have like some fancy word for that, but we don't have to get into the lingo. Like we don't think it's about people being in the grip of neoliberalism or, critical race theory or whatever boogeymen people are complaining about on the left or the right. It's not that that stuff has no effect, but we don't think that's fundamentally it. And we also don't think it's fundamentally that people are especially immoral in terms of their character. Probably on average, the people who enter higher education are above average in terms of character. Like there's variation, but they're normal people. So instead we think of it as, and we try to analyze everything at first through the lens of perverse incentives. So do you have, from an economic point of view, you can think of institutions as sets of rules. Like, the property rights, for instance, are a set of rules. The rules about who's allowed to touch and interact with and modify and sell various objects out there in the world. So property is fundamentally an institution. Democracy is an institution about how you make other rules. Marriage is an institution about how people relate to one another and so on. They're rules. And then we ask, are some of these rules set up in such a way that they reward people for doing bad things, or they don't incentivize people to do the right thing, or they allow people to sort of take advantage of others and externalize the cost of their behavior onto others? And this is a pretty common way of thinking in economics. It's really basically the standard way of thinking about institutions. And then we just take that tool set, which has been developed for centuries by others, and just apply it to higher education in a pretty standard way. And then we start seeing that it has a lot of explanatory power. It's not that it explains everything wrong with higher ed, but it explains quite a bit. And it also maybe uncovers things that maybe people weren't noticing.
Now, with regard to student learning, you wrote that according to standardized testing, almost half of students demonstrate no appreciable gain in critical thinking, analytical reasoning, problem solving, and writing between the beginning of their freshman year and the end of their sophomore year. And I say that, I cringe inside when I say that, because I currently have a daughter who is just finished her freshman year and just beginning her sophomore year. And of course, I understand the expense involved. So I'm thinking about the return on that investment. Now, can you explain the methodology behind this discovery and why you think this is happening?
Yeah, great question. And for one thing, it's worth noting that we maybe get into this later. Higher education has a pretty high return on investment, especially for people who finish. It doesn't for people who don't, even if they don't learn anything. And there's a lot of economics to explain why that happens. So the learning and the return on investment tend to be somewhat separate. Fundamentally, the real issue isn't even just that, like, I'll talk to you in a second about studies about how people try to test whether people are learning. But I think the real more fundamental problem is the very lack of testing in the first place. When BMW says our, X3 M40 or something can go 0 to 60 in 4.6 seconds, they don't just make that up. They run the machine under a wide range of different circumstances that are meant to look at real life driving behavior, and they can say this is like a pretty good estimated average of what it's likely to do in the real world. It might vary from place to place, but that's they have actual testing to prove that it has that. What's really the problem in higher ed is that we don't even put ourselves through the level of rigor and testing to see if we're delivering the things that we promise that we're delivering. We do things like we have people write an analysis of a sonnet and we grade that, but then we make these further claims about, we think that they're learning how to write in general and how to think in general, or how to understand and care about diversity in general. And then we also claim that once they learn these skills that they learn in their classroom, that they'll take them and apply them outside of the narrow context in which they've learned them. And we don't even bother to check. So we take it really easy on ourselves. And I think that is the fundamental problem to begin with. Now, that said, there are a few researchers who have tried to test these things more rigorously. There's a rather substantial literature on transfer of learning, which is the claim that if let's say you learn like supply and demand analysis and microeconomics, well, you could take that concept of supply and demand analysis and use it spontaneously to understand how people relate to each other in dating. But the question is, will people do it? And then educational psychologists have tested this at length with a huge number of laboratory experiments and real world activities. And the answer is overwhelmingly no, people don't. It turns out for most people, learning is highly compartmentalized, even to the point that, you can teach people to memorize strings of letters and then have them try to memorize strings of numbers after they've been trained to memorize strings of letters. And they're surprisingly lousy at memorizing strings of numbers, which you think would be easier. It's like that bad. So that's part of it. And then, we cite a number of other books and articles on the general learning. Because one question is like, if people learn something, will they transfer it? But the second question is, do they even get these general skills? Probably the most famous thing we cite is by Aram and Roxa, called Academically Adrift. And they use this thing called the Collegiate Learning Assessment, which is explicitly designed to look at the so-called soft skills, like your basic quantitative ability, your basic writing ability, your critical reasoning skills, the things that we say people get from liberal arts education. And they give students this test over and over again at the beginning of their school, partway through, later, like after the sophomore year, and then later when they're about to finish. And they look for trends in how well they perform. And what they basically find is, the exact results depend upon, some level of like specificity in which statistics you use and how rigorous you want to use them. But, a pretty decent summary is like the bottom 50% of college students don't have any gains and it really just get worse at mathematics. The next 40% get slightly better, but not even like a standard deviation better. And really only the top 10% of students have more than that in terms of gains. And when I say the top 10%, I don't even mean, if you go to places like Georgetown and Brown, where I've been working, that all of those students have appreciable gains. No, they mean even at like elite universities with so-called elite students, really a smaller percentage of people are actually getting appreciable gains, and most of them are not. Now, if I were to criticize these things, I might think, there's often a criticism of testing that says when you give people tests and they don't count for anything, they half-ass them. So maybe they understate how much they've actually learned. But, there are, I can't name off the top of my head like who's done this, but there are people who have tried to overcome that by giving them like incentives, like if you do well, we'll pay you, and you get basically the same results. Like it just really doesn't seem like they're learning all that much. So they don't learn much, and what they do learn, they don't spontaneously transfer, which is really the premise of liberal arts education. We will give you these skills and you can use them anywhere. It is true you can use them anywhere, but it's also true you probably won't.
Now, students are frequently asked to measure their own teachers' effectiveness. Now, you do claim that students are pretty spectacularly bad at this, with nearly no discernible correlation between measurable student learning and students' estimates of their own learning. Despite this, it seems like teaching evaluations play an outsized role in institutions' evaluations of teachers. Some of the places, for example, where I teach as an adjunct, I get the feeling like teaching evaluations may be the only measure that they apply to me. I don't know that for a fact, but that's sometimes the impression that I get. What can you say about what's actually going on there in the case of students evaluating their own teachers?
Yeah, there's a robust literature on this. I mean, it's gigantic. Probably in the past month, many papers have come out testing this again. It's amazing how unequivocal and univocal this stuff is. Overwhelmingly, when they try to determine, does having a high teaching evaluation correlate with something you could measurably call learning, you get the answer no. Or alternatively, you get, actually, it does have a negative correlation. That's really where the debate is right now. Is it not related, or is it slightly negative related? And again, talking about sour grapes, we actually put our teaching evaluations in the book. And if I were to continue to do that, over the past few years, I've gotten a bunch of 5s. I've actually gotten a higher raise than I normally would get because of my teaching evaluations. However, that means I'm probably a worse than average teacher. That's probably what that means, given the research. It's really hard to test this stuff, and that's part of why the reason universities don't. But you have to, if you really want to know how do these evaluations correlate with learning and teaching effectiveness, you need to control for other variables like the quality of the students who are coming in, even things like what are you teaching them, what's the kind of class, what time of day is the class taking place, because students are going to be meaner to you in the morning or at night than they are in the middle of the day. The rigor of the class, the material that you're covering, is the class mandatory and so on, or is it something they had as an elective? All these things are confounding variables. And if you were to try to test anything out there in the world and not control for obvious confounds like this, you'd get thrown out of a social science journal. But luckily, psychologists do try to test this, and they do take care of it. And oftentimes what it requires is running an experiment, often in military schools, where they can force students to take, they'll say, we're all going to teach the same stuff, and we'll do it with randomly allocated students, and we can force them to take classes because they're in a military school. We can boss them around. And then we will measure how much they learn over time after getting a baseline and making sure that, we don't have biases like all the gifted students are in one class and the less gifted students are another. We control for that. And when you do that kind of stuff, what you find is, again, either student evaluations are not at all correlated with how much people learn, or alternatively, they're slightly negatively correlated. And yet, interestingly, there are studies and surveys about what people think of them. Overwhelmingly, faculty think student evaluations are not valid. They're reliable, but they're not valid. That's actually what the research says. Faculty are right. Students are pretty mixed about them. They're not really sure. And interestingly, administrators tend to believe that they are valid measures. I'm not sure why, because the research says that they're not. I do think there is a weird thing where you might have a self-interested motive, given the dynamics of higher education, to continue to use teaching evaluations, even if they're not valid. Because frankly, we all sort of see this firsthand. Faculty and admins are sort of at odds with each other. We have some conflicts of interests. There's a tendency for resources and power, if they're allocated to faculty, that kind of comes at the expense of admin. And if those resources and the power goes to admin, it comes at the expense of faculty. And I think the use of student evaluations is something that gives admins power over faculty. It allows them to punish them for not teaching the right way, allows them to try to make faculty replaceable or interchangeable. So I think there are some selfish incentives to do that, but I don't want to overstate that, because overwhelmingly when you survey administrators, they just believe that they're effective or that they're valid, even though there's a massive amount of research saying that they're not.
It's funny, as you describe that, I'm remembering when I was a full-time faculty member at a college of technology, my observation was that my teaching evaluations were, I don't know how to say it, I didn't think they really accurately captured whether students learned anything. And so I began to do a series of tests. Since I was teaching, the entrance standards to the college had not changed. And I was teaching the same course. One of the courses that I was teaching was the same every semester, an intro to critical thinking course. So an entry level course. And so I began to do a series of experiments. And of course, I got exactly the results I suspected I would get. So one semester, even though the course was, exactly the same. And by the way, it's not taught to a single section. This was typically I would teach about 3 sections of this course. I would, on the day of the evaluation, I would bring in something for them to eat. And I always got better evaluations when I did that. Another semester, immediately before giving the evaluations, I told the students that the evaluation was going to ask them to reflect on the course, and so it might be useful to take a moment to, as a group, reflect on the course. And I would basically show on the screen at the front of the class the teaching or the learning objectives for the course. And then after each one, I would remind the students simply where in the course we had covered that. In other words, simply asserting to the students that they had learned it because I had taught it. And so now then they go into the evaluation feeling as if they're totally pumped full of knowledge. They can recall all of this material. And of course, those evaluations were noticeably better as well. And I thought to myself, gosh, this process is a very malleable process. The actual process of sort of administering the evaluation itself.
And research verifies that all that stuff works. Things like the attractiveness of the faculty member, that matters a lot. Interestingly, there's some research that says that heterosexual female students will rate the attractiveness of their female professors as more significant than like heterosexual male students. It's surprising. Things like how funny you are. I mean, one of the arguments is that all it is fundamentally is a personality test and a test of how entertaining you are. And you might think, yeah, but entertaining might mean they learn more. But if you can check that and it turns out no. And one of the best ways to manipulate it too is just give higher grades, which is what everyone worries about. And it's true that we do know that that's not just speculation. That's what the research says, that all things equal, the higher grades you give, the better your evals will be, which is terrible in part. Like I had one of my colleagues used to do this activity with our MBA students, which was absolutely fantastic. It was honestly, I think it's probably the best thing that happens to the MBA students in their entire time. It was just basically they walk in on the first day and they think other people are bad, but I'm good and I would never do anything wrong. And then he proves to them, basically within 3 weeks, he proves to them that all of them will cheat by getting all of them to cheat. And then they get so pissed at him and they gave him terrible evaluations. But it was wonderful. I mean, like that, if all our MBA program did was that and skipped everything else, that would be worth doing. I think, honestly, that's more important than all the other stuff they cover in the program. But again, it pissed them off. And so he'd get terrible evaluations and like all these angry letters and stuff like that because it doesn't make them feel good. But that was a great learning experience. Like they literally thought they were immune to all the activity and problems of business ethics, and you prove to them they're not. Oddly, though, I do something similar with undergraduate students, and they love me for it. So I don't know if I just deliver it better, but
actually, would you like to share that?
Sure, because it's not likely that they'll hear this. Here's an example of the kind of thing I would do. I'd have them read about the Milgram experiments, where you shock people, and you think so. Experiment you're pretending to shock somebody. And they learn about conformity and how people can be induced to do bad things because they're told to by an authority. And then as they're reading that, and we're talking about in class, I'd say like, okay, next week we're going to do an experiment in class. So I need you to do is go to the dining hall and steal forks and bring them in. And then when people would like make weird faces at me, I'd use the script right out of the Milgram experiment. Like this experiment requires that you do this in order to succeed. And unbeknownst to them, I did talk to maybe the manager of the dining hall and said, we're going to do this. So I'm not actually breaking any rules, and then they would come in and we would talk about things and they'd ask them like, all right, what do you think this experiment was about? How many of you brought forks? And they would so far, everyone brought one except one student. She profusely apologized, but she said that her friends were mocking her and were like, you can't steal a fork just because your ethics professor told you to. And then I would ask them, what do you think this experiment's about? And they would say, no idea. And I'm like, would you steal a fork because I told you to? And they're like, oh, damn it. And I've done variations of that where they would disrupt another class and like throw out the professor's drink and turn off the lights and that kind of thing. And, you know, because they might know that I do this, so I'll do like some variation. And they always fall for it. And it's just to sort of prove to them that even if they learn like about the Milgram problem, the problems of conformity and authority, that doesn't automatically immunize them from it. They have to really be on guard. But when I do it, I don't know. I just sort of say it like everyone's like this. Everyone has this problem, and maybe that they're okay with it. Maybe it's because they're 18 when they experience it, and 18-year-olds are more open to this than 25-year-olds. I'm not sure.
You know, there's in my intro to ethics class, there's a thought experiment that I do with the students. I'm sure this is widely done. It's that thought experiment where, you know, there's a little box, a little box with a button on top, and I basically say, you know, I'll give you $1 million to press the button. But if you press the button somewhere in the world, someone that you do not know and would never have known and will have no effect on you whatsoever, that person will die. Someone will die. And, you know, and I say, okay, it's $1 million. So how many of you will press the button? And I promise this is not a trick. You will not ever know who that person was. It's not like, you know, your mom's going to die. And, you know, typically about a third of the class will raise their hands. And I suspect the number's actually higher. But some people can't bring themselves to, you know, fess up in public. You know, and it's really interesting. So a third of the students will raise their hands. And then I say, okay, so the rest of us know, you know, who the murderers for hire are in the class, because that's all I really just did. You know, I basically just asked you to be a hitman and made it very painless and very rewarding to do so, to be one. You mentioned increased grades, which is a beautiful segue into my next question, which I'm so much looking forward to hearing you talk about this. The book makes the surprising claim that there's no evidence that grade inflation is actually happening. And when I say that, I actually picture my audience, anybody in my audience who's, say, 55 or older, their eyebrows are either rising or their eyes are widening. Because belief in grade inflation, it seems to me it's sort of one of those bedrock principles in higher ed. So how can this be? Can you take us through why you claim this?
Yeah, and I was a bit surprised to say that myself, I have to admit. When I started writing it, I didn't think I'd come to that conclusion. But there's a little bit like, imagine I walk around and ask 60-year-olds, hey, were kids better behaved when you were a kid? And they go, yeah, they were. I'm like, okay, great. Can you prove it? Well, actually, in this case, we have more data, so they might actually be able to do it. Although they probably find that kids were actually like worse behaved in the 60s than they are now. I think that's what the data says. They were doing drugs and stuff like that at a higher rate. But that it's a little bit like, but I'm really sure that like back in the day that grades were like, you know, A meant something in the 60s and it doesn't mean that now. And I do think that there is the best argument for there being grade inflation is just that because college has expanded so much that there's been a push to like keep people enrolled, and oftentimes more and more marginal students have been admitted, but they're able to maintain their grades and stay in to some degree. So that's probably going to cause grade inflation. But I think it ultimately comes down to like, well, what do we mean by grade inflation? How would we actually measure it? And has anyone measured it? So think of it like this. You can mean by monetary inflation, and this is the same problem with like monetary inflation and what you mean by that. If you just mean things are like the nominal price of things is higher, well, you have to look at something like a standard basket of goods that people are buying. You need to see like correct for like the quality of those goods over time and so on. And it's pretty sophisticated and complicated to do that. And so when economists are looking at price inflation, they're often looking at that kind of thing. Like how much has like, you know, a standard basket of goods that people have the same effective demand for, how has that changed over time? So the analogy for that with grading would be, we need like an idea of what would have counted, like what would have counted as an A in the past or a B in the past or C in the past? Do we have something like a standard paper or standard assignment? And we can actually measure over time what kinds of grades people have gotten on that. Just looking at just mere changes in their grades doesn't by itself tell us. My previous employer, Brown, had the average GPA went from like a B+ to an A- over something like a 20-year period. And this is a case where the data for this was actually public and you could check it. It was with representative samples and fully public data. And But at the same time, like the average SAT score went up by something like 100 points, and the GPAs went up by something like 0.3, and like the selectivity went up dramatically, where it went from having like a 16% acceptance rate to about a 5% acceptance rate. So you might expect that if you had exactly the same standards over that 20-year period, that this ever increasingly better prepared and more elite student body would get better scores. Maybe it makes sense that they would get an A-. It might even be that despite the average GPA going up, in fact, there's been a kind of deflation because maybe the GPA isn't rising as quickly as their actual skill. That's possible. How do we check? Have we actually checked that? Well, no one ever checks that. Interestingly, no one in the literature has, as far as I know, I've looked, and I'm not the first one to say this, people like Edelman and a few others have said this, has actually tried to look at quality of student outputs over time and then correlated that with grades. Just isn't out there. But even more surprisingly, there's very few people who've actually tried to research like just what is the actual level of grades over time. And so there was a Department of Education researcher named Clifford Edelman, who, because he worked for the Department of Education, was able to kind of force universities to give him transcripts. And he said, like, all right, in 1982, between 1982, or what was it, from 1972 to 1982, average GPAs in the US went up a little bit by about a third of a letter grade. And then by 1992, they went down. He had a representative sample of 30,000 transcripts taken at random from a bunch of American universities. So he didn't have like noisy data or data that was like provided that's unreliable. And then no one's really done anything like that since. If you go to the gradeinflation.org webpage, and I mean, I haven't looked at it in the past year, maybe it's suddenly fixed all of its problems. But when you go to it, you find that a lot of the data it's getting is coming from things like student self-reports. It turns out student self-reports and their GPAs are pretty unreliable. They have this weird social desirability bias where they report that their actual GPA is higher than it was. Non-representative samples. And then in a few cases like Brown University, where he's like linking to, the university itself releasing like anonymized transcripts and its own analysis of its data, then you have the problem of, well, do we know if this is a statistically significant effect? Do we know if it's because of changes in student quality? I suspect what's going on is that at the elite universities, students are probably better now than they were in the past because they're more selective. If grade inflation does exist, I guess I'd worry more about the universities that are serving marginal students where there might be pressure on faculty. Like a lot of these universities are tuition dependent, and there might be pressure on faculty to pass people who shouldn't pass in order to keep them happy and keep them enrolled. That's where I would suspect something like grade inflation might really be happening. But again, it might be that it's real. So the complaint is more like we don't actually have the kind of evidence that we would need to rigorously test it and really rigorously prove it. But everyone seems to just assume that it's real.
Well, for my next question, I'm actually going to give you an opportunity to enlarge on the point you made earlier that, butts in seats translate to money for individual departments. You say that program requirements are self-serving for faculty and universities rather than students. So there's presumably some trade-off. What's better for the faculty and universities isn't necessarily in the students' interests. Can you expand on that a little?
Sure. I should start by saying that there's this ideal of the kind of properly liberal arts educated individual who is well-rounded and knows all sorts of things. I want to say I share that ideal, right? So I do think it's important that you understand music. It's important that you understand math. It's important to be able to think scientifically. It's important that you understand problems of social justice and diversity, that you be able to write, that you be able to read complicated text, that you have familiarity with foreign languages and so on. I mean, one of the things I've been doing in the pandemic has been learning French for the hell of it. It's of no use to me at all. Well, it turns out I'm writing 2 French articles as a result, but I didn't expect that. So I'm like that. I get that. However, I then wonder, does this stuff actually work? Imagine taking a bunch of people to an art museum. Imagine you take a 1-month-old infant, a completely disinterested teenager, and maybe, I don't know, some other person just doesn't care let's just say a blind person to an art museum with paintings. And, the 1-month-old infant can't really understand what's going on, can't see it. The teenager doesn't pay any attention. And the blind person, by hypothesis and blind, it can't see it. So the things that they're encountering might be intrinsically valuable. It might really be wonderful if they encountered them and understood them and got something out of them. But if you spent $100,000 doing that, you've really just wasted your money. And if you force them to do it, you've wasted their time because they didn't get much out of it. And you might say, at least with a teenager, it's his fault. And maybe you're right, but still, you have to make the decision about whether it makes sense to pay a lot of money to enforce this person to waste their time. So that's what I'm worried is going on with a lot of gen ed classes. When we look at things like the collegiate learning assessment, when we look at these other things, we find students don't really seem to learn much. They don't really like the classes. They don't really care about them. The things the classes do deliver often can be delivered in some other way. And by the way, I don't mean to include things like very carefully crafted general education curricula, like what's at Chicago or Columbia or like St. John's College, where I think students self-select into that carefully curated curriculum and get a lot out of it because they want to. I'm talking about just more like the kind of thing that happens at like the University of Arizona or something, right? You just force people to take a range of classes. However, so they don't really learn much, but it's expensive and time consuming. They're spending sometimes half of their career just taking these classes in which they don't have any measurable learning. These classes are taught by adjunct faculty or lower status faculty, or like sometimes even like administrators who maybe don't even have a terminal PhD or don't have much expertise in the field. Not to be mean to admins, there's some wonderful admin like teachers and so on, and a lot of people who are full-time teachers suck. I'm happy to admit that, but and then they start finally like learning what they actually care about. So I think we have the burden of making sure that they're actually getting from those gen ed classes what they want. We have this sort of prejudice that's like, well, I think it's important that you know how to, change the tires in your car. So therefore, I'm going to force you to take a tire changing class. Okay, well, at the end, after that, do you actually know how to change your tires? 6 months later, can you change your tires? A year later, can you change your tires? If the answer is like even a year later, you don't remember how to change your tires, probably just wasted your time, right? And that's time that could have been spent on something more valuable. So that's already bad enough. But then on top of it, as I mentioned earlier, the thing that seems to be the best predictor that you will be forced to take a class in a particular department is the financial neediness of that department. So some departments have lots of money, they have lots of research time, they have a very high student to faculty ratio in terms of majors. The people who work there have lots of outside job opportunities, there's lots of external research funding. Those places is usually like, well, you have to take a class in one of these departments and you can pick whichever one you want. And then what you find is that especially MLA disciplines, modern language association disciplines like comparative literature and the languages and English and so on, they will require you to take 3 or 4 classes, sometimes more, directly in those departments. And they're incredibly financially needy. They have terrible job markets. And so like a place like Arizona State University in Phoenix, I think it worked out to be something like they would offer 550 English classes a semester, and 500 of them would be taught by adjuncts and would be like an intro composition course, which measurably does not work. And then 50 would be taught by more senior faculty. And again, the people teaching those classes might be getting paid like $3,000 per class. But in terms of tuition, when you work out the averaging out the tuition, both for like what the students pay and what the state university system pays to the department, they might be making like, 10 to 20 times like the instructor's salary from that class. Sure, and that gets redistributed to the department.
Well, for my final question, I'd like you to talk about cheating. You describe widespread student cheating as a, quote, prisoner's dilemma. So as a philosophy teacher, of course, I'm always interested in the prisoner's dilemma, but I'll bite. What do you mean?
Yeah, I think that there is a collective action problem to it because many faculty grade on a kind of implicit curve and some on an explicit curve, meaning I'm not going to give everyone in this class an A. So if like a lot of students are working at a certain level, then I'll give you a B. But if they hadn't been working quite as well, maybe you would have gotten an A- or something like that, right? You kind of like give an A to the best students, then an A- to the next best, and an B+ to the next best, and so on. I think even in classes where people see themselves as doing an absolute grading, that's what they tend to do. There is a sort of zero-sum aspect of grading, and it's worse in some places than others. Like at my own university in the business school, we literally had a curve until This past year, I lobbied really hard to get rid of it. I succeeded. It's gone. It's dead. It'll stay dead forever. But we had it for a long time. So in those places, like, you literally have a curve and it's literally zero sum. Students, if you're listening, cheating works. On average, students who cheat succeed in getting better grades than they otherwise would have gotten but for the cheating. It is true that on average, the people who cheat a lot get worse at grades than the people who don't, but that's a selection effect. Students who are really gifted don't cheat as much as students who are less gifted, who have poor time management skills, and that in turn makes them do worse. But the cheating itself, insofar as there's a literature on this, says that it's pretty effective and people tend to get better grades. So now think of that. Imagine you're in a system where you know lots of other students are cheating, and professors aren't doing anything about it. They're not catching it. Most cheating is not caught. Most people get away with it and they get a better grade. Then you might start thinking, well, if I don't cheat, I'm a sucker. I'll get a worse grade than I otherwise would have gotten. And it's unfair. And someone should be policing this, but they're not. But if I do cheat, then I'll probably rectify the situation partially and get closer to the grade I would have gotten in a system where no one was cheating. I don't want to overstate that. I don't think that's happening everywhere, but I do think that does happen in some classes where there's pervasive cheating. And once there's pervasive cheating, you have not only a perverse incentive to cheat yourself, but I don't want to say justification, that's too strong, but a partial excuse where you're like, my failing to cheat just exposes me to being a sucker. Like let me give you an example. I'd say Georgetown in our business school, when we had the curve, it might be the kind of thing where they give the same exam in all the Accounting 101 sections. And so you have a friend in Accounting 101 who took the final exam early, and he walks to the class and calls you and says, here's what's on the test. That happens all the time. We know that was happening. We're not like catching all these people and punishing them, but we do surveys and we ask them, they admit that they're doing that. I asked my students about this and they're admitting that it's widespread. Oh, other people are doing this. My friends are, wink, wink, so now like your friends do that and like give you this information, but like they don't give someone else that information. Well, all things equal, that person will now get a worse grade than you because it's curved. So given that you have that information, it makes it more fair if they have it and they copy it. Now, what would be better is if there's no cheating at all, but faculty surprisingly don't have much incentive. Well, actually have a very strong disincentive to catch cheating. Like at Georgetown, it's if I catch somebody cheating, it's an incredible pain in the ass how much work I would have to do. It would literally be 15 hours work. I spend like 200 hours a year on teaching, like if even, frankly, probably not even that. So if I catch someone cheating, though, it's going to cost me 15 hours of work. That's a massive increasing amount of time I spend. So I don't have much of an incentive to catch it, right?
It's just to interject and tell you how right you are. Just this past week, I caught a student cheating. I couldn't believe how time consuming it was just to process that. And so I actually went back and tried to kind of quantify the time. And as near as I could tell, that one student cheating took me about 9.5 hours to process that, per the university's regulations.
Yeah. Amazing. Right. I mean, so you have a strong incentive not to bother with that. Not everyone works that way. When I was a graduate student, they had a pretty good system where like, if someone had cheated, you would just bring them in and tell them, here, you cheated. I'm going to fail you in the class. And unless they protested, that was it. That was the end of it. And also, by the way, if they'd had previous problems, it would go to a hearing, but it didn't necessarily bring you in. And they would just take care of, like the dean of students would take care of themselves and be like, okay, this is the second time you've been caught. You'll get a suspension. But at Georgetown, it involves like the Pope and like the apostles, and everyone has to get involved. It's a really drawn out, lengthy process. There's independent investigators. The system, by the way, is really, really corrupt. I actually quit the honor code system because I thought it was like so, even though I absolutely despise cheating and I like want to nail people who do it, our system was so bad that I like gave up and I tried to change it through the legal system, but I couldn't get it done. So anyways, and so you have an incentive not to do it. And just think of like a simple thing you could do. Like imagine this. When you put your student evaluations down, you just put in the following question. Did you cheat during this class? Just that by itself. We know students will admit bad things because they'll write things in student evaluations like, this professor is a smelly jerk and I hate him. So if they're willing to write that, they're probably they know it's anonymous and they'll be willing to admit that they cheated. Now imagine like you don't know anything about who's cheating in your class or how they're cheating, but you get your student evaluations back at the end of the semester and you find out that 70% of students have admitted that they're cheating in some form. You'd probably look over your syllabus and revise it and revise how you grade and the kinds of assignments that you get to make it less likely people would cheat. But does anyone do that? No. Not that I know of. I put that in a book that people should do that, and I've never bothered to contact the registrar and do it myself. So there you go.
Well, it's funny when you mention that. I think to myself, I wonder if it would be 70%. What I have observed over the years is that a smaller and smaller percentage of students perceive that what they are doing is cheating. That is what sort of counts for cheating in their minds. It becomes sort of more and more significant cheating. And the things that might have been frowned upon long ago, maybe now are taken as commonplace. It's just a sense I get. So I could be wrong.
No, I think you're right about that. There's work by Douglas McCabe, Linda Trevino, and they have a couple of their co-authors who I'm sorry I forgot their names. I'm sorry to them that I forgot their names, not just to listeners. And they've done this extensive research over time, really starting with like work that was done in the 50s and 60s that they're copying the methodology of. We do have evidence that people's conception of what counts as cheating is getting more narrow. However, and this is sort of the good news, maybe it's nice to end with some good news. If you just ask them, instead of asking, did you cheat? If you ask them about specific behaviors, did you substantially copy a piece of someone else's writing? Did you get advice from somebody about what was on the test who had taken the test before you? Did you bring in a cheat sheet or something? Like if you ask them about specific behaviors, what you find surprisingly is that surveyed students say that they're cheating at about the same rate as they were in the 60s and 70s and so on. It's actually been fairly stable. And really, it looks like students cheat much more in high school than they do in college. So something like 70% of students, including honor students, will cheat in a substantive way in high school. And then it gets to be about 50% or so who will cheat substantively in college. And only maybe about 1 out of 10 that are kind of like serial cheaters. Who just cheat all the time. And again, those students who are serial cheaters tend to do pretty badly, but it's not that the cheating doesn't work. It's just the fact that you feel that you need to cheat so much means you have bad time management skills and aren't very good. And so you get bad grades for that reason.
My guest has been Professor Jason Brennan, the Robert J. and Elizabeth Flanagan Family Professor of Strategy, Economics, Ethics, and Public Policy at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University. His book, Cracks in the Ivory Tower, The Moral Mess of Higher Education, is available from Oxford University Press. Jay, thanks for joining me on the podcast today.
Thanks. It's great talking to you.
Thanks for joining me. Please feel free to email me with questions, comments, or suggestions for content that you'd like to hear about. You can reach me at mortarboardpodcast@gmail.com. Consider stopping by my blog, mortarboardblog.com. The blog contains links to stories that I think will interest you, podcast transcripts, and articles I've written. You can also like me on Facebook at Dr. Daniel Barwick or follow me on Twitter at Daniel Barwick. Looking forward to talking with you in the next episode.